Real classic. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, now a major motion picture. One, Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat at the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wraith-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the low section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg? I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she roughhoused a little to try to make herself feel better, and one of the girls said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she threw the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and she arrived home with a blouse torn in a big bruise under her one eye. Sandy and Denny's, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, was disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. "A delinquent, that's what I am," she thought grimly. "That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them. Everybody else. I wish father..." But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back from where? And when?" Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smuggling, vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. "Why can't I hide it too?" Meg thought. "Why do I always have to show everything?" The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close to her, about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under it again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come so many nights tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in a rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might blow right off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky, to land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable. "You asked to have the attic bedroom," she told herself savagely. "Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment." "Not during a hurricane. It isn't a privilege," she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of her bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her huge, innocent eyes. "Go back to sleep," Meg said. "Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me." She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse brown hair and that stood wildly on one end, and let out a sigh almost as noisily as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame, in spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to cover. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Suddenly she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she'd heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on the back of the road as it was, and this time maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll's house. Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. When must everything happen to me? She demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood and listened. Not a sound of Charles Wallace's room on the right. Not on the left, her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother, sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing again at her glasses as though they could help her to see better in the dark. Dennis was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with the succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners and good at games. And when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy or Denny's. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking, but it wasn't a tramp this time. Then, Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come? Suppose he has a knife? Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody cared, anyhow. I'll make myself some coca, she decided. That'll cheer me up, and if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table, drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there alone in a big old-fashioned kitchen. A blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you." From under the table where he had been lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on the doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned. One winter night he was. Meg's father had decided part one-owned setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all his own. "Why didn't you come up to the attic?" Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age. "I've been scared stiff. Too windy up in the attic of yours," the little boy said. "I know you'd been down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How did he always tell him? He never knew, or seemed to care, what Dennis or Sandy was thinking. It was his mother's mind, and Meg's he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were afraid of him that they whispered about Mary's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright? I've heard that clever children often have subnormal children, Meg had once overheard. The two boys seemed to be nice, regular children, but the unattractive girl and the baby boy certainly aren't all there. It was true about Charles Wallace. Seldom spoke when anybody was around, so many that people thought he had never learned to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost age 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it was clearly because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way in his own time. I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me," Meg had said. "Oh, my darling, you're not dumb," her father answered. "You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go in its own pace, and it doesn't happen to be the usual pace. "How do you know?" Meg just demanded. "How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me? I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I've given you a number of tests, you know." Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and that had been more of her with Charles Wallace and the four twins. And for the twins. "IQ tests, you mean?" "Yes, some of them." "Is my IQ okay?" "More than okay." "What is it?" "That I'm not going to tell you, but it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to do yourselves. Just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk, you'll see." How right he had been about that. Though he himself had left, Charles Wallace began to speak suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences. How proud he would have been. "You better check the milk," Charles Wallace said to Meg now, his diction clearer and cleaner than that of most 5-year-olds. "You know you don't like it when it gets a skin on top. You put it more on than twice enough milk." Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. "I thought Mother might like some." "I might like what?" a voice said, and there was their mother standing in the doorway. "Coca," Charles Wallace said. "Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'll be happy to make you one." "That would be lovely," Mrs. Murray said, "but I can make it myself if you're busy." No trouble at all." Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator, his pajama feet patting slowly as the kittens. "How about you, Meg?" he asked. "Sandwich?" "Yes, please," she said, "but not a liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes?" Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. "One." "All right if I use it on Meg, Mother." "To what better use could it be put?" Mrs. Murray smiled. "But not so loud, please, Charles. That is, unless you want the twins downstairs, too." "Let's be exclusive," Charles Wallace said. "That's my newest word for today. Impressive, it is, isn't it?" "Prodigious," Miss Murray said. "Meg, come let me look at that bruise." Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that the attic fears were gone. The cook was steamed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums blowed on the windowsills, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums bumps in the center of the table. The curtains, red with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn and seemed to reflect the cheerfulness throughout the room. The furnace purred like a great sleepy animal. The lights glowed with steady radiance. Outside, alone in the dark, the wind still battered against the house. But the angry part that had frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Mrs. Murray's chair, Fortinbras let out a contented sigh. Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with long dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tightly in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. But one side would come out curly and the other straight, so that she looked even plainer than before. "You don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling?" Mrs. Murray asked. "A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's the nasty bruise the Henderson boy gave you. By the way, shortly after you'll be gone to bed, his mother called up to complain about how badly you hurt him. I told her that he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are. I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining, but she seemed to think that it was all your fault." "I suppose that depends on how you look at it," Meg said. "Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry, I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feeling." Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. "You know why? I hate being an oddball," Meg said. "It's hard on Sandy and Denny's, too. I don't know if they're really like everybody else, or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help. You're too much straightforward to be able to pretend to be who you aren't," Miss Murray said. "I'm sorry, Maglet. Maybe if Father were here, he could help you, but I don't think I can do anything till you manage to plow through some more time." Then things will be easier for you, but that isn't much help right now, is it? Maybe if I weren't so repulsive looking, maybe if I were pretty like you. Mother's not a bit pretty, she's beautiful, Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age. How right you are, Mrs. Murray said. Just give yourself time, Meg. Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. No thanks. He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. Yours will be done in a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you. Who's Mrs. Whatsit? Meg asked. I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while, Charles Wallace said. Onion salt? Yes, please. What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for? Mrs. Murray asked. That's her name, Charles Wallace answered. You know the old shingle house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live. They, Miss Watson and her two friends. I was out with Ford and Bruz a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school, and Meg. We liked to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took off after a squirrel, and I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house, so I met them by accident, as you might say. But nobody lives there, Meg said. Miss Watson and her friends do. They're very enjoyable. Why didn't you tell me about it before? Mrs. Murray asked. And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles. I know, Charles said. That's one reason I didn't tell you. I was just rushed off after Ford and Bruz without thinking. And then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency anyhow. A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. I don't think I like this wind, Meg said nervously. We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's certain. Alright, we're going to stop here. I hope you guys enjoy the sneak peek, and it's a great book. So, hopefully you can read this somewhere else in your library. I'll see you next time.